Right, so I thought I'd share with you this, Getting By Lisa McKenzie, which was published this year, and it is currently my absolutely favourite book. I've literally been accosting people in the corridor and telling them to read it. I'm really evangelical about it. And part of that is because it really talks about reflexivity in a way that really clicked with me, in a way that the work that you do is really about what speaks to you in your own experience. So why does it matter? Right, Lisa McKenzie, in her book Getting By, explains that she's the working class daughter of a striking miner. She's the first one to go to university in her family. On page 1, she talks about what it felt like as a 16-year-old during the miners' strike to read George Orwell's description of the dirtiness of the working class in The Road to Wigan Pier. And she talks about what it feels like to see yourself written about, which I think is a really interesting thought. And then she goes on, and I'm just going to read out a couple of sort of key sentences. Don't worry, I'm not going to read it all, although I would quite like to. She says that this book is filled with stories like her own. Fortunately, not all of them my own, but stories and narratives I've collected over the last 9 years in the estate that she lives in. And I think that's a really important point, that this isn't just about thinking about how fascinating your own story is. It's about thinking about how it fits in with other people's stories. She goes on, my own journey into higher education and into university life is also important. The University of Nottingham is only 3 miles away from St Anne's Council Estate where I live. Until I attended an interview, I had never been to the university. Residents of St Anne's know very little about this great institution for learning, which is on their doorstep. I thought that raised some really interesting ideas about what are we doing here? What is the relationship between academia, higher education, and the world that we live in? After her mother died in 1999, Lisa McKenzie enrolled on an access course at the local college. And while she was studying there, they had a visitor from the Sociology and Social Policy Centre at Nottingham, who introduced them to a study called Poverty, the Forgotten Englishman in 1970, which is a piece of research taken by Ken Coates and Bill Silburn in the area of Nottingham that Lisa McKenzie lived in. The research was set in St Anne's and concluded that people who lived there were suffering terrible hardships because of poor housing and low wages. I didn't know that this was a subject that you could study at universities, or that communities like St Anne's, where I lived, were interesting and relevant in academic studies. And then she concludes, narratives and storytelling are important in working class lives. It is how we explain ourselves, how we understand the world around us, and how we situate ourselves in a wider context. We learn to make sense of what sometimes seems the senseless through narratives. So for me, what that reminds me is that people aren't just data. Data has its own human life and subjectivity. When we write about everyday lives, our representation of those people becomes part of their story, not just in terms of how people feel about the way that they're represented, but what does it feel like to be represented in history? What do we do about it when we see ourselves represented in history? In some ways, everyone in this room has seen their story told somehow by historians, whether it's sex, gender, age, class, region, background. All of you have seen yourself somehow represented in history. How are the stories that are told about us ways of keeping us in our place? Are they ways of inspiring us, or are they ways of telling us where we should be? I also think one of the things I really took from Lisa McKenzie's book is the way in which telling your own story can be a way of changing the system, that there's a politics to getting heard. Rather than being studied, being heard is a political act in itself. So for Mackenzie's analysis, getting to university, accessing higher education, isn't success alone. This isn't some kind of liberal celebration of getting into university as a working class woman. The value is in understanding what that means, understanding it in its own terms. This is about more than getting access to institutions of the privileged. The value is about what she did with that academic training, opening up who and why we study. In the rest of the book, it is clear, and that's what I really love about this book, it is clear that the people she works with have been doing as good or a better job of analysing and making sense of their lives than all of those sociologists who've been studying them. Okay, so there were two lessons for me. One is to think about how you are representing others, and the other is to think about who you're representing when you talk about yourself. All right, Lisa McKenzie, getting by it now.